everyone! Today I'm going to go over how to get started and create this beautiful striping shawl. Let's get started. Let's jump right in to how to get started knitting this shawl. The basic concept of what you're doing with this piece is very, very straightforward. It's a 4-row pattern that you just repeat over and over again. There are a couple of very, very small little things that may trip you up, so I'm just going to go over all of those. The first thing, and probably the most important, has to do with how you manage your ball of yarn. This piece works by using one ball of yarn. So we used the Ba Yarns shawl ball, which is an extra large skein of a fingering weight sock yarn base. That is a gradient. It goes from one end is purples, it goes through pinks and peaches and oranges and yellows and greens into the teal, and then the teal section is very, very long on this shawl ball. This is actually their colorway called Yarn Truck at the End of the Rainbow that they dyed for us based on the Yarn Truck art that we had done. So you can see in the, our Yarn Truck has this sort of coloring on it, along with all of the brights in there as well. So this is done with just one ball of self-striping yarn. You can, of course, do the same project with another ball of self-striping yarn. It doesn't have to be that exact one, but you will only get this effect if you use self-striping yarn. So if you do this pattern with a variegated yarn or a solid color yarn, you're not going to get the same effect. So I would highly recommend a self-striping yarn. Now, the other way that this works is you do 2 rows of the pattern, pulling your yarn from one end of the ball, and then the next 2 rows of the pattern you do pulling your yarn from the other end of the ball. Since your yarn stripes is a self-striping yarn, those 2 ends of your ball are going to be different colors from each other. So if you were trying to use a solid color yarn and you're looking at these instructions and saying, why in the world would you knit from 2 different ends of the solid color ball? It's because this only works with self-striping yarn to get this effect. So I have this ball of yarn. This is not a self-striping ball, but I think it's good to illustrate what I'm talking about from the 2 different ends. So you will always have the end of the ball of yarn that comes from the center of the ball. And as you pull this end, the ball of yarn sets still and the yarn just comes out of this end. So that is one end of your ball of yarn. And then the other end is the end that comes from around the outside of your ball of yarn. So as you pull it, your ball of yarn is going to rotate around. So when I'm talking about the 2 ends of the ball, those are the 2 ends that I'm talking about. Now with this pattern, you've got 2 options for how to deal with your yarn management. The first one is to leave it all in a ball, just like this, and pull from the 2 ends. This is what I did. And the positive side of that is you don't have to make any decisions about how to divide things up. You don't have to keep track of 2 different balls of yarn. The downside of it is much more challenging to untangle your yarn if it gets tangled, because the 2 ends are connected to each other with this ball. So that is one option. The other option is to take your one ball of self-striping yarn and divide it into 2 balls. And then you're going to work 2 rows with one ball and then 2 rows with the other ball. And the 2 balls will be different colors because they're self-striping, and the colors will change at different rates. If you choose that option, it is easier to untangle them if they get tangled, but there are 2 balls of yarn that you'll have to manage, so it's not that they won't tangle, it's just that when they do, they'll be easier to untangle. The downside of that is you have to divide it in half. If you have a scale, this is the perfect time to use it. I personally am not a gizmo person, but I use scales for my knitting and crochet as much as I use any other tool for it. So I would recommend buy a $5 scale, just a kitchen scale, very, very basic. And so what you'll do is you'll put your ball of yarn in the scale, and you will wind a second ball until the scale tells you that you've got both balls weigh the same. You've got half the yarn on one ball and half the yarn on the other ball. If you don't have a scale, but you have a ball winder that has a yardage counter on it, I think this is pretty unlikely, even as a yarn shop owner. I don't have one of those. But if you do, that works as well. Look at the total yardage on the yarn and divide it in half. And that's going to give you your 2 different balls. If you are doing this exact ball of yarn, the Ba Yarns yarn truck at the end of the rainbow, the teal section is giant. It is a full half of the ball of yarn. They did that on purpose for us because the entire truck background is teal, so the majority of the truck is teal, so they were capturing that visual with it. But it is very easy to divide this particular ball of yarn in half because wind until you change from the first teal into the next shade of teal, and that's half your ball. The other way to do it is to guess, kind of eyeball it and look at it, wind them into about half and just realize that you may run out of one before the other, and either your shawl may be a few rows shorter or you may have an extra few ends to weave in as you sort of redistribute those extra balls of yarn. So those are 3 ways to divide your yarn. If it were me, I would probably just eyeball it unless I was using this, in which case the color change is a real easy way to go. So that is how I would recommend doing your yarn management. If you do choose to do it the way that I did, where you're pulling from both ends of the ball of yarn, what I would highly recommend is when you are pulling from the center, you set your ball upright so that as you pull from the yarn that comes from the center, it doesn't interact with the yarn from the outside at all. So you're just pulling this. And then when you are doing the 2 rows where you are pulling from the outside, turn your ball of yarn upside down so that that center, the yarn that comes from the center, is underneath. And then when you're pulling from the outside, it's not going to interact with that yarn that's coming from the center. So the yarns don't interact with each other, so they don't get tangled. And as long as you're diligent about that and your yarns don't get tangled, I found it really easy to work from the 2 ends of the ball of yarn. As you get right down towards the end, everything kind of collapses. Also because you put it down and pick it up a bunch of times. But I mean, this truly is like the last 20 yards of the yarn here. So it's not a big deal to have to untangle this section. So that's my tips for yarn management for this project. Now I am ready to show you guys how to do the tassels for the edge. So I put tassels along the edge of this, all the way along the long curved edge. Just as another little design feature element of that. They're very easy to do if you've made tassels before. These are going to be the exact same process as you have done previously. And it is all laid out in the pattern. All of this information is there as well. The pattern is available on Ravelry.com and it is one of our Nomad original patterns. I will put a link in the description for this video to take you to the pattern if you choose to purchase that, and it's got all this information as well. But when you are creating the tassel, the pattern is going to tell you you are going to do it on the 10th color stripe. So let's pick colors that are more distinct you can see. So we're counting like the ridges that are formed by the yellow as opposed to the flat parts that are formed by the teal that go in between is what we're talking about with those color ridges. And so you're going to count up 10 from the last tassel. So the tassel is here. So we're going to count these ridges. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you count up 9, and then on the 10th one is where we're going to put the tassel. And so to do the tassel, you are actually going to finish the row. So you are going to the end of the row with your colored yarn, and the pattern tells you to knit to 1 stitch from the end. So you knit until you're 1 stitch from this end. Then you're going to do a yarn over, so just wrap the yarn over your needle, knit that 1 last stitch that's there. So that adds your 1 extra stitch. That's why your piece gets wider on one side, is because you're always doing that on that side. And now the pattern is telling you to cut your yarn cut your working yarn only the one that's on that end. Don't cut the other end that's connected down at the other end of yarn. You're just cutting the one that you're going to be making your tassel out of. We never cut the other end of our yarn. So we're going to cut that. We're going to leave about an 8-inch tail there, 6-8-inch tail. And the pattern is now going to tell you to cut lengths of that yarn. So we've cut this yarn, it's not connected anymore. When you first start out, your piece is really narrow and your tassels are really small, because a giant tassel at this end would look weird. And then as your piece gets wider, as you get out closer to the end of it, you're going to have a much larger tassel. So you can see the small little purple tassel, and then the much larger like seafoam green tassel there. And we'll trim, I will trim these at the end so they're all like nice and even lengths from each other, and they're just going to get larger as you go. So for this will be the largest tassel because it is at the widest end. The pattern is suggesting that you go ahead and cut 7 lengths of yarn, about 12 inches each. So you're going to go ahead and cut those. I, as you can tell, just eyeball them, but you certainly can measure if that would make you feel more comfortable. And it is incredibly important, the pattern says it, and I'm going to say it again here, you need to cut this yarn as you're making the tassel. You can't sort of go in and add these later, because the tassels change color with the color change of your yarn. So if you don't cut them while you're there with the yarn, you can't necessarily go back and get any more of that color. So make sure you're cutting them as you go. 2, 4, 6, 7. So I cut 7 strands. You just want to put them in a bundle like this with the ends about even with each other. You're going to fold that in half. So you've created this loop here at the midpoint. And we're going to be putting this loop here at the midpoint through our fabric where we want our tassel to be. The issue is there's not a lot of fabric where that tassel wants to be. So I recommend in the pattern and here that you actually go ahead and start going back again, create a little bit of fabric there. It's just going to be easier to attach the tassel if you have that little bit more fabric. So I'm going to take my my tassel yarn. You have to cut it now, but then I'm not going to attach it until I've done a little bit more of the knitting on this next section. So when I'm reattaching my yarn, because remember we cut it here, so my yarn's not attached, I'm going to take that same end of yarn, I've just cut the sections out to be the tassel, I'm going to lay that so that that new yarn is about the same length as the tail I cut the first time, so 6, 7 inches hanging there. And I am going to begin doing the knit row. So what this the pattern for this row is to just knit this whole row going all the way back. So I just put my needle in, lay my yarn around with that tail hanging out, so the 2 tails that are here are the same length as each other. And I'm just going to start knitting. So I do, and you can actually do a couple of rows before you connect your tassel yarn, or you can just do a couple of inches worth of knit stitches and then connect it. You may find it a little bit easier if you've actually done several more rows to create some more fabric, but it's not too difficult to do if you've just gone a couple of inches in worth of knitting. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to go ahead and attach the rest of the tassel yarn right here where these 2 tails are hanging out. So we're going to grab our tassels again. We've already folded them in half and we have this loop here. And I am just going to push that loop through. To me, there's a pretty obvious little hole here, right there where I put my finger through in the fabric. That's where I'm going. So I am just going to push the loops all the way through there. You can use a crochet hook if you find that easier than just putting it through, or kind of use your knitting needles to help get it through. But for me, it's not super hard to just poke it through with your fingers. And now I'm going to reach through this loop that I just put through, and I'm going to grab all of the yarn that's hanging down there. So the tassel fringe that I cut separately, and also those 2 strands that were connected to our work. And I'm going to pull all of them through, and then I'm just going to tighten it up so that it's tight there. It looks just like this. This is fairly secure as a tassel on its own, but just to give it a little bit extra security and I think make it look a little bit more finished, I'm just going to tie an overhand knot. So I make a loop, I pull that extra fabric through, or all of the tails through the loop, and I'm just going to cinch that, tighten that extra little knot down right there up close to the fabric. And that is our finished tassel. And that's all there is to it. And this piece is now tantalizingly close to done. As I mentioned in the pattern, when you're all the way finished, we are going to trim these tassels so that they kind of get longer gradually as the shawl gets wider. And I will be back in just a minute with the all the way finished shawl, and we'll talk about blocking, which is the last thing you'll need to do. I've officially finished the shawl! I was very excited to finish this one because I really loved working on it, and I was excited to see it be done. So the last step with any knitting project, but definitely with this one, is blocking. I feel like blocking is one of those things that's so easy to do, but it scares a lot of people just because they haven't done it before. So I like to make blocking super, super simple. This is my piece. All I'm going to do is I fill up a vessel. Your sink will work just fine, but it's harder to bring the camera to the sink than the sink to the camera. So I use a large mixing bowl full of tap warm water. So turn your hot water tap on to full hot and put some water in it. And then you're going to take your piece and you're going to drop it in the water. You want to smush it down just so that it's fully submerged in the water, so that all of the piece will get wet, but you don't need to like wring it or do anything crazy with it. I don't generally put soap in with mine, but if you want to for some reason, if you dropped it in the dirt while you were working on it or worked on it with pizza grease on your hand or whatever and you feel like you need to clean it, you certainly can put a little drop of soap in here. Don't go overboard with the soap, would be my recommendation. You're going to let that soak for a couple of minutes. If you forget it like I do and leave it overnight until the next morning, that's fine too. You just need the fibers to have a chance to fully absorb all of that water. That's all you're aiming for. So 5-10 minutes is plenty. 12 hours is also fine. One thing that you may have noticed before I put it in is that I have not woven in the ends yet. So obviously we're not going to weave in the tassels, that's part of the design, but there's the ends of the balls, like at the very beginning and the very end, not as part of the tassels, just the end of the tails of yarn. Those are going to need to be woven in to finish the piece. Don't do that before you block, because the point of blocking is that we're going to stretch our fabric and just make everything lay nice and even. Our knitted fabric is stretchy. When you weave the ends in, you'll go back and forth just to tuck those ends in. Those straight pieces of yarn going across are not stretchy. So if you weave your ends in and then you block it, you're going to pop all your ends out, or you're going to have like puckery fabric. So just don't weave them in until you've blocked it. That was plenty of time to let it soak. What all you are going to do now to finish the blocking process is lay it out flat so that you like the way it looks. With a shawl, we're not trying to achieve any specific measurements at all, so I'm literally just going to lay it and kind of stretch it until everything looks pretty and let it go. If you're blocking something like a sweater where there's like exact measurements, you may pull out a tape measure and you may need to stretch it more or less. For something really precise, you can use something called blocking pins, which are just any rust-proof pins that you'll put through your fabric to kind of hold it in place as it dries. I'm not going to use those for this shawl piece, and I like to avoid using those if I can, because what can happen is you can have a nice straight edge and then you can put your pin in and it kind of pulls that edge out and it gives it a little wing, and then the pin will keep that wing out, and so it instead of making it better, it makes it worse. I like to use blocking mats. They're just like a foam mat. The ones I have are like the puzzle piece shape, so you can make them whatever size and shape you want. Full disclosure, I stole this from my children. They normally are in our living room for our kids to play with. Anything that will be okay for stuff to dry on is fine. If you have carpeting at some place where no humans or domesticated animals are going to step on it, that's fine. Some people, if you have a spare bed, will put it out on their bed, on the couch cushions, on tile floor, whatever you want to use, as long as it's not going to be ruined by having damp cloth on it for a day or two. I like the blocking mats if you're going to put pins into them, because the pins go in really nicely and keep it there. So you are going to pick your piece up. You're going to wring it out. You will probably get a little bit of color bleed. I'm seeing a tiny bit. This water has a little bit of a bluish tint to it, especially when you're dealing with yarns that have blue base or red base. Those are notorious for releasing a little bit of extra dye. There's nothing wrong. Like, your yarn is not becoming less blue. There's just a little bit of extra dye particles in there. And most yarns will do that, even commercial yarns, a little bit the very first time they get wet. So wring out as much water as you want, or as you can. I sometimes will roll it up in a towel as well to get some extra water out, but it is so hot right now that this is going to dry super quick. I don't need to do that. And you are going to start at one end. So you can see these are the ends of the yarn that I still need to weave in. I haven't woven those in yet. So I'm going to start at one end, and you're just going to lay it out. So you just lay it out this way. Obviously it will be on the ground when I'm working on it. But you want to just make sure like all of the lines are parallel to each other and not sort of going at a weird wonky angle or anything like that. Maybe put the fringe so it's all coming straight, just so that it's going to dry in a nice orderly kind of way. Now you may be thinking, what is the point of blocking? And the point of blocking, there's a couple of them. The biggest and most important one that makes blocking important to do no matter what kind of project you're doing or what material your yarn is made from, is it just allows all of the stitches to even out a little bit. No matter how experienced a knitter you are, you will always have a few stitches that are a little tighter or a little looser. And when you're looking at it like a big expanse of knitting, it will always have these just couple of weird little spots that are just a little bigger or a little smaller. That is totally normal. That will never go away. I have been knitting for 20 years and professionally for 10 of them, and I absolutely have those in every project that I do. You're not doing it wrong. That's just because you're human. Blocking them will get rid of that. It will let the tiny little bit of tighter ones loosen up a little bit, the little bit looser ones kind of give some extra yarn to the stitches around them, and it will just make all of your stitches look neater and tidier and more professional and just cleaner. The other reason that you do blocking, so that reason holds no matter what. If you're making a sweater out of acrylic yarn, if you're making a hat out of wool yarn, if you're making a washcloth out of cotton yarn, that will happen no matter what. No matter what the yarn's made from, no matter what project you're doing. The other reason has to do with more specific projects. So if you're doing lace, blocking is going to open up that lace and make the lace lay a lot nicer. With this project, this is a very open fabric, so you can see me through this fabric. Blocking it makes it open up more. So this piece is going to be significantly larger now that I've blocked it. It just grows and stretches. It's going to get drapier and just more of that ephemeral sort of quality that I'm looking for in this piece. And so blocking it is going to help with that as well. So block everything. If it's something like a cotton washcloth, okay, maybe the first time you use it, and it gets wet, that's probably close enough to blocking. But the first time you get something wet, it will block. It will have that change happen whether you want it to or not. And sometimes blocking can be dramatic. A piece can grow dramatically. Not always, but sometimes. And so kind of be aware of that. This brings up a whole nother point about gauge swatching and blocking your swatch to see how much your piece might change with blocking. But definitely give blocking a try and have a look at me laying this out outside to dry to kind of see what the actual blocking process looks like when I'm doing it. I hope that you enjoy the shawl if you choose to make it, and check out all of our other designs as well.